February 23rd, 2020. The day that altered the direction of Malaysian political landscape from an unseemingly political coup that shattered Pakatan Harapan's helm at leadership from the historic win in the 2018 general election. Hi, this is Norman Goh and you're listening to Bicara Minggu Ini. A year after the infamous political coup, some would say a backdoor government by Perikatan Nasional led by Bersatu's president Muhyiddin Yassin and the faction that broke away from PKR's leadership led by Azmin Ali. It all happened within a swoop, and a year later, where are we today? In this first episode of the special series Sheraton Move, a year on, I'm speaking to Bridget Welsh, the Honorary Research Fellow with the University of Nottingham, Malaysia's Asia Research Institute. There we go. So thank you very much, Bridget, for joining me today in this episode. And how was it so far in year 2021 for you?
Well, it's now the year of the ox, and I'm very glad that the year of the rat is over. So I'm looking forward to a new year, but it is a very challenging year for Southeast Asia. For me, I'm particularly concerned about what's been happening in Myanmar. Many of my students are in jail. So it has been a very trying time for the region.
Looking back, yesterday was exactly a year since the final Pakatan Harapan Presidential Council. Everyone was actually thinking that it might be, a point where Pakatan Harapan was going to split at that time, but it came out during the press conference. They gave Mahathir the sort of consensus. But what happened 2 days after was the infamous Sheraton Move. So for a start, how do you see Pakatan Harapan today, 1 year on?
I think what we're seeing is that the opposition coalition, which it is now, is still very much locked in the past. There are still the issues of leadership problems where they haven't been able to come to grips with the differences that they have among their leaders. We see that in comments over issues of senior minister and so forth. And I think that also the tactics, right? They're continuing about wanting to go back to power, right? For the mandate that they had of the past. And I think these number games reflects a kind of a return to the past, which in fact is actually the country has moved on, right? They have to offer something new. And I think in some ways, it's not just that they're locked in the past, but that the situation is worse, that they have not necessarily come up with a path to move Malaysia forward. And they have not, for example, formed a shadow cabinet or shown that they can actually lead. So I think this is a very challenging time for Pakatan Harapan.
Now, do people actually have a full grasp of the political coup last year, or was it more of a combination of several events that led to the fall of PH?
I think when people think about the Sheraton Move and what happened the last year, they see what they see, right? There's some people who will say that it was all about Mahathir. All right, and that he's the one who caused the problems, and he resigned, and he didn't pass on the baton. And there are others who look at kind of broader, multiple factors in this. I think if we step back, however, I think this transition really represents not only a shift in terms of political power, but kind of the challenges that the political system is facing. How do you deal with new coalition governments forming outside of election time, which is going to happen in a fragmented system? Now, how are you also going to deal with the issues of personalities that are being in their interests and patronage that are being put over the interest of policies? How do you deal with the fact that the system is so elitist that the interests of ordinary voters are actually being left out, which was very clearly on display during the Sheraton Move? And I think these are real significant challenges that Malaysia faces as its political system is evolving and changing. And right now, Malaysia has not been able to manage the issue of a fragmented system. This is partly why there is an emergency right now. Italy forms a new government. Malaysia declares emergency. These are very different ways of resolving conflict or coming to compromises. And so when we look at the Sheraton Move and the change last year, I think people want to lay personal blame and personal narratives. But I think that the issues are really, to me, more structural, and they speak to the real challenges of how Malaysia is going to accommodate its differences and move towards a more inclusive, but also more effective type of governance.
But generally, do you see politics from both sides are getting more and more dissociated? The system, when you point out the problems of the system, but the culture of the politics here, do you think that it is getting more and more dissociated from the ground itself?
It's always been somewhat disassociated because the system is about the elites, right, who feel that they have a sense of entitlement to be in power. This is particularly what we saw during the UMNO year-led BN governments. But I think that elitism has been so much on display during this period. It creates a helplessness among ordinary voters who feel like that their voices don't matter and they can't affect the outcome. And I think the parties have become much more disengaged from the electorate and from even their own political base as they try to make new alliances all about supposedly numbers. And this has really eroded the connection to society. When, in fact, the mass-based parties like UMNO, like PAS, had already begun to lose their patronage connections to the grassroots. So there is definitely a fundamental shift taking place in the kind of the elite grassroots relationship and the way that politics is being engaged. So they have to use things like identity politics or issues as a way to kind of embrace the situation. And this, of course, means that people don't feel necessarily as connected to the system, and also that there's a kind of emotional types of issues and polarizing issues that sort of focus on the way that campaigning takes place. So yes, disengagement, but also transformation, but not necessarily healthy transformation of the politics.
Focusing on Pakatan Harapan and its partners, losing the Sabah state election last year, where you were there for about 2 months, is seen as a blow to the coalition and the cooperation between members of the opposition bench. How do you look at this?
Well, first of all, I'm looking forward to the opportunity when the MCOs are over to return back to Sabah. It's a wonderful place. And I highly recommend anyone who would like to take a vacation within Malaysia to go to Sabah. But stepping back from that, looking at the issue of what happened there, yes, it was a blow, and it was also not a blow. Let me explain why I say that. I think that we definitely see the lack of cooperation that happened at the elite level between PKR, for example, and Warasan. The announcement of "I have the numbers" in the middle of a Sabah campaign really showed a kind of disconnect among the different partners and their priorities. And I think that there are some of the distrust that happens within Pakatan Harapan still comes from the Sabah election. And I would also point out that the Sabah election is also the place where the distrust between Bersatu and UMNO really escalated. So I think it's not just for one side, it's actually for others as well. But I also think it's quite interesting when you look at the voting patterns. And I'm very fortunate to be working with two colleagues, the Malaysian Sumaya and Benjamin Lowe. We've got a new book coming out called Sabah from the Ground. It's hopefully going to be out next month with Gerak Budaya. And it's a collection of essays. And one of the things that we find in this in our analysis and among the groups of us who are writing in this book is that we actually see that public support for the opposition remained quite strong. The Warasan Plus captured a slightly more popular vote than GRS did. We also saw that there was, even in an election like that, considerable turnout, 66%, two-thirds of people showing up. And we see that the polarized situation of Sabah politics, which in some ways has its own kind of regional dimensions within Sabah itself, is still quite strong. And so, in a sense, when you say, is this a blow for the coalition? In fact, their support base is still there. Harapan's support base is still there. It's not moving. And in fact, events that sort of catalyze that support base actually strengthen it. And so while Sabah, Warisan Plus lost the election by 6 seats in very, very close contests, I think that it wasn't in some ways as much of a blow that people realize.
We're seeing UMNO is pressing a call for an election once the emergency is lifted by August this year. It might be earlier, we don't know. There's no clear partnership on both divides. So while looking at PH and their partners at the moment, is Pakatan Harapan still a model of branding? Is it still viable in the next general election? I'm actually very interested to see, you pointed out that the base in Sabah has actually strengthened more for the opposition, Warisan and the PH partners. But do you see the whole PH model working with the other coalition partners? Does it work in the next general election?
Well, I wouldn't say it strengthened more in terms of Sabah. It stayed there. And I think that's the thing to keep in mind. It didn't erode as many people think it did, right, in that contest. But in terms of looking at what happens in terms of what the broader situation for Pakatan Harapan, what can happen, I think that it's clear that there are tensions within Pakatan Harapan. And how they resolve them will determine what happens. All right, and I think you need to look at who is going to lead the Harapan, right? Which is most likely going to be Anwar Ibrahim. What sort of alliance relationships they're going to have in a meaningful way. In particular, whether or not they work with UMNO or not in that context, and which parts of UMNO did they work with. All right, and also important is what sort of program the initiative. Pakatan Harapan support will not necessarily be support for Pakatan Harapan. It will be support against the current situation. And I think this is one of the challenges for an opposition coalition, is that the tactic politically is to mobilize frustration, to mobilize anger. And I think that predominantly, and not exclusively, predominantly, especially in these circumstances. And I think that how that's not going to be enough, right, to keep the coalition viable in such that it has some clear sets of priorities and a program for the country. So when you say, well, do I see it changing and do I see it need to change? Yes, I think it needs to change, not its leadership, the parties themselves and how they operate with the ground, the way that they're engaging for voters, and especially they need to change their program. It has to have a clearer vision that people can connect to. And I think they'd be surprised. I think they tend not to give the Malaysian public credit. But the Malaysian public is very well aware and very sophisticated at multiple levels, and I think that this would serve the coalition well.
Yeah, I think you're right to point out that, sometimes the perception from the political elites thinking that the Malaysian voters are too simplistic. But I think you're right on saying that it's even more sophisticated and sometimes complicated. That's what I think too. So what do you make of Dr. Zulkifli Ahmad's suggestion that they wanted Anwar as the Prime Minister candidate and working together with Dr. Mahathir again as a minister mentor, similar to the idea of the Singapore's minister mentor during Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Chok Tong's time. But in the midst of that, right, there's a distrust between supporters of Anwar and Mahathir. Will that actually work out? What could be the possible scenario next? How will Shafi Abdal or the leaders of the other coalition partners come to play?
So there are a couple of things there, right? So let's take this Singapore senior minister business. Malaysia's not Singapore; it's its own country. These type of systems don't work. Following this particular model won't work. It's well-meaning. The comments are trying to accommodate the different differences, and I think Dr. Zul has tried to do that. But I think interesting to see how the Malaysian public really responded quite strongly to this discourse. I think at the bottom line is that Mahathir is not wanted by those who want change, who are looking to the future. And I think he was given a second opportunity to govern, and he's played a significant role. What happened with the Sheraton Move, and so I think that the trying to accommodate the elites just speaks to the elite nature of the political system. And it really doesn't necessarily recognize that views of Mahathir have shifted from the perspective of, there are still people who will support him and respect him, and especially what he did for the country, and other people would see very differently. But the fact is that he ironically personifies a lot of what happened at the Sheraton Move, and Malaysians don't want to go back to that. It was a very traumatic 2 weeks of time where there was so much intense uncertainty in a country that had not used to experiencing that, and I think that in order for the country to move forward, it cannot have this kind of bringing Mahathir and Anwar together again in this context. Now, the second part of your question was about what other parties are there, right? And I think, when we think about what's happening to the opposition more generally, we have to recognize that the opposition is comprised of essentially 3, maybe 4 major groups. Pakatan Harapan parties, the core parties, DAP, PKR, and Amanah. And they will have their tensions in some ways, but they have pretty much stayed together during very large tests at different points of time. And there have been lots of offers put on the table to many of them. And then you have a second group of parties, which is, the Mahathir and the Mudas. And in some ways, we could put Warisan in that. They are seen to have kind of more affinity to Mahathir, but I think what mostly they represent is that they're not Anwar. All right. And so in this context, they represent different constituencies, and how they will fit into the mix, what alliances they make, I think will be very important. Warisan will, I think, continue to hold on to win seats in Sabah. Many of the seats, not all, but many of them will be very competitive. And so I think that they will still be players. Muda is still not necessarily defining its position yet, but I think it is engaging and shaping the discourse. And then the third group of opposition actors, which I think need to be put on the table, is UMNO. I mean, in fact, arguably, in many ways, UMNO's criticism of Muhyiddin has been louder than other opposition forces.
Yeah, they're even louder than Pakatan Harapan.
Exactly, right? And so, and where will they fit in? It is no question that whatever you say, if they're going to have BPM ship or not, which I think is unlikely to have at this point, the fact of the matter is that the grassroots in UMNO are very uncomfortable with Bersatu. And the elites may tell them something, but they'll walk in a different way. And the question is, where will they walk in and what type of configuration? And I think that at the elite, among parties, the opposition is going to change. My expectation is we're going to see new types of alliances, or if not, we will see, if not a formal coalitions, because I think that may be depending on the timing of when elections are held. I think what we're going to see instead are some cooperation, not to have competition against others, and allow to see how people win or don't win as things move forward.
Yeah, I remember one of the observations I shared yesterday was from the elections in 2008 until 2018, we were actually moving towards a two-party kind of system. But after 2020, things really realigned very differently from what we were expecting. So moving on to the other aisle, of the ruling administration of Perikatan Nasional, what future holds for Muhyiddin and Bersatu, as well as Azmin's camp in a loose coalition with PAS, Star Sabah, SAPP, and Gerakan?
All right. So I wanted to make this point in the start, right? So if we look at what might happen to Pakatan Harapan, I think what's interesting is that they may become like GRS in Sabah. All right, aka loosely allied groups where they do their own thing in their respective seats and they come together to form a government. And in this context, it brings attention to what happened in Sabah and also what's happening in the kind of the PN government more generally, right? Within PN, to me, obviously, we've discussed this earlier, UMNO is the most important party to determine the future of the coalition. And its splits are not just about national leadership, it's also about the soul of and the dynamics within UMNO itself. And it's a very trying time for the party. And we can see it's going through this period, and it's not able to adapt. But the parties that I look at in PN that I think are going to be very important in the trajectory of the country, the most important of which to me is PAS. What happens with PAS? PAS has now come out of the Sheraton Move as a national party with national standing. In terms of government experience, it's actually gained an important state government of Kedah, and which means that it moves from being just an East Coast party to kind of having power on the West Coast. And I think, it has been careful to, it will probably can be able to win and position itself in many, many seats to come out of the next election in a stronger position than it has now. And I think it wants to have its cake and eat it too, right? It wants UMNO to not contest against it, and it wants Bersatu to give it as many seats as possible. My projection is that there will be some sort of reckoning between PAS and UMNO as things move forward. But it depends on how the party splits. But I do see PAS as gaining support because it has been very careful in that it's not leading in PN, right? So it's basically following as part of a consensus process. And so being there legitimizes among its political base. At the same time, it's not necessarily alienating many people who might consider voting for it. In interesting ways. The other two parties I look at are based in Sabah. And I think that they're interesting because I think in terms of looking at GRS, the first of which is Star, right? Jeffrey has always been erratic, moving one way or the other. And Jeffrey has chosen to stay, right, at this point of time. His party gained ground at the state election, and I believe that they will try to gain nationally in this process. And I use Sabah as the arena in the sense that I'm looking at what's happening also in Bersatu. And Bersatu is now become a party in Sabah as well as in the country as a whole. And everyone thinks that everything is fine inside Bersatu, but that's not necessarily the case. And as it gains power, it's going to have to wrestle with some of the different factions that it has within it. And those, I think, have become more complicated after Sabah than before.
Oh, we have such a complicated. This is like a polygamous relationship with official and unofficial marriages between parties. We've now passed.
There's a lot of divorce. There's a lot of divorce.
And it just reflects.
And unfortunately, there are also too many affairs.
Yes, it's just strange bedfellows among the political parties. Right now it's we've seen the strong partnership between PAS and UMNO post 2018 election with the formation of Pakatan Nasional. But now PAS is also an official member of Perikatan Nasional. How does that jeopardize the working partnership with UMNO in Pakatan Nasional? So instead splitting of Malay votes to 3 in 2018, that was then. So we will see votes further split among Malays in a snap election?
I think that that's highly probable. But I think that the core PN is still forming itself, right? And we look at what's happening within the parties, as I mentioned earlier. But BN still has its roots in the ground. And BN becomes very important when it goes to election time in terms of this process. And whether or not BN stays together inside PN will determine, I think, whether or not they have electoral viability. Because keep in mind, PN doesn't have grassroots on its own. It relies on the BN component parties. But Malaysians at the same time are sick of, they can't confuse between MN, PN, BN. They're all, too many different sets of coalitions. And this, in a sense, may create low voter turnout. It may turn people to look at the candidate in a more sophisticated way, and to look at local personalities. And it may actually, create the fragmentation that I see potentially happening, where people become, the parties end up having to kind of focus on defending their base as opposed to kind of a macro picture. So the narrative of politics may not be about a kind of, sets of programs, but about representation, about patronage, about service. And that type of politics, the kind of localized politics, it's important, but it's not necessarily healthy for Malaysia to manage its crises that it's facing with right now.
When we talk about from the importance of the events going on in Sabah, and then how PAS has evolved itself from an East Coast based party to a national level. Now we have, a lot of people don't really see the importance of the role of Gabungan Parti Sarawak GPS. So do you think they are considered as a kingmaker again in future?
So first of all, one of the nice things about Malaysia is that there are many kings.
It really reflects the number of kings in Malaysia.
So we have 9 sultans, and we have 9 major players that can be kingmakers in politics. With GPS and Sarawak being one of those, right? A major one in terms of determining what's happening in the future. I think it's likely, in my view, that the Sarawak state elections will happen before the national elections. And if it is pushed off further, then I think that they will happen maybe consecutively. But I think that there is clear drive on the part of GPS and Sarawak to want to have those elections early. They were supposed to be held by August. I'm not of the view that the emergency will end earlier. I am of the view that the emergency will be extended in that process. And I don't see elections happening this year at this point of time, because you don't call an election, you can't win in that context. Now, where does GPS fit into the larger spectrum? I think that their numbers are important in the national picture. But GPS is not just about the numbers. It's also about the messages of different types of politics. So they're speaking about issues of decentralization of power. And they're also talking about, issues about raising different conceptualizations of ethnic politics. And this is where, GPS and Warasan and other parties in Borneo states articulate very different visions of what Malaysia means as a nation. And so when I look at GPS in terms of its political role, I don't necessarily exclusively say, okay, who's going to win versus other actors. I see what the narrative implications and the structural power relationships that have shifted. I think for good or for bad, and I think most of this there are some negative elements to it. But what we saw from Adinan before GPS was formed, that there was more empowerment of Sarawakians, and from a perspective vis-a-vis the federal government. And that has continued under the GPS. And they have, been pushing for kind of more rational sort of solution politics and kind of addressing some of the underlying issues. The challenge is that when you rely on a narrative that is also, one of the most divisive narratives in the country, which wants to split Borneo from the rest of the country, I think that this is also has high risks. And that in itself is one of the worrying trajectories that we're seeing in politics. And people in Peninsular Malaysia don't necessarily realize how significant the kind of calls for decentralization and have taken and the intensity of them compared to the past. So where do I see GPS? I see it being part of the system, and I think that but changing the system in its own way.
Yeah, that also put into question since Adnan Satem was the one who really pushed about questioning the relationship between federal and the state. What do you make of the trend of young voters, with Undi 18 came into play, with Muda making its fray for the first time? Do we see a similar groundswell among younger voters? Will you see a more young candidates running for office in the next few general elections?
So first, I think with Muda, we're going to see more younger candidates run. And that is definitely an important element. How they configure in the system, if they're not registered, they may work through another party, for example, and to register themselves. So I do see more younger voters in younger candidates seeking office. And I think we have to step back, however, and look at 2 or 3 other things that are important. First of all, the first is whether or not the 18-year-olds are registered or not. There have been worrying signs that this is not going to happen. And it may not, it's not that it's never going to happen, but it may be delayed in happening. And in that context, this would be a very big mistake, because I think it will backfire among younger voters for the government in power. And this brings me to the second point, which is that younger voters, in terms of their composition, are decisive in changing any election results. They were a critical part of G14 and what happened in 2018. Younger voters helped to put the oldest prime minister into office. And younger voters can do the same in the larger context of whatever happens moving forward. But what we have seen, and this is my third point, is that the trend among younger voters is that there is a lot of disengagement, unhappiness with the political process. And this is true of most Malaysians across the different spectrums. And it's not, there's unhappiness, but there's also what people often talk about is confusion. They're just exhausted about all of they just don't want to keep up with the scenarios that are just, because it doesn't necessarily change their lives in any meaningful way. But the parties are not adequately engaging younger members and younger voters, and they're not also and they're taking younger voters for granted. We see that there was the sharpest drop in turnout among the by-elections that have happened in the last 2 years, and also in Sabah among younger voters. And so getting them to the rolls is one thing, but getting them to vote. And then, we've seen, no real program that talks about the issues for young people. There's focus on schools and there's focus on laptops. But this is not a meaningful program. They help address some of the immediate concerns, but they don't talk about where is there going to be long-term sustainable jobs for young people. How are the structural problems of unemployment going to be addressed? Where are the different skill sets that are going to put young people in the new economy for Malaysia? And, where are there going to be places for younger voices being institutionalized, normalized inside? There still is a very deep patronizing view of young people. And this in itself is not yet changing. And it's going to take more time for that to shift.
In a closing note, in general, how you see the political landscape change and its direction leading up to the next general election in this year itself. You're projecting that it might not be called this year, it may be next year. Looking at the timing itself, how would the landscape itself in the political landscape, how things are going to change leading to next year?
So as I look towards the future of Malaysian politics, I look at three immediate questions among the elites. All right, the first question is, how long will the emergency last? The longer it lasts, the more that there will be shifts and changes in that context. Right? The second issue is, when do they actually call the elections? Malaysia is a country where they have a lot of early curtain calls, like I'm going to call, but there's still no show, right? There's still no election, and I think that they don't have to call them till 2023. So UMNO may push and pressure, but they may not necessarily get what they want in terms of these issues. The third thing that I'm looking at in terms of these issues is who will actually continue to lead different political parties and actors. Will it be the same players or will it be new players? All things being equal, it will be the same players now, but that may change. Let me give you an example of something that would change the situation quite radically. If there's no longer Hadia Wang in PAS, or if there is no Muhyiddin Yassin, choosing not, for example, perhaps to contest again, right? And Hadi choosing to retire, for example, right? These are options, right, that may change the political landscape. So these are things at the elite level. But where I see the biggest changes are not at the elite level. In fact, one of the problems is that the elite level is not changing, and there's a disconnect between them. There is now in Malaysian politics very new currents, some of them positive and some of them negative. Let's start with the negative first. The negative is that there is a lot of cynicism about politics and disengagement. There's a sense that people don't have a channel for their hopes for kind of bringing about reforms, especially given that reforms have actually, many of them have been fundamentally reversed. And this cynicism is actually eroding into the system. It's like an acid into the political system that I think will be very hard and particularly impact young people who feel a sense of disempowerment. Even if you vote for people, they change parties, as what happened in the Sheraton Move. So why should we vote? These type of sentiments that are very real. And I think they haven't gone away. They've actually intensified. But the positive sentiments are something different, and that is there is that people are recognizing that they can change politics without the politician. So they can actually engage in policy discussions, and new think tanks are emerging and opening up different ideas. There are actually different forms of mobilization. People are actually having communication across different issues that allow and forging new types of relationships. There is that sense of recognition that the government is not necessarily going to solve the problems for Malaysia, that Malaysians maybe need to solve the problems on their own. And that, of course, is a hard thing to grapple with, but it is a meaningful thing, because that means that there opens up the possibilities of a different younger generation and different leaders who have different sets of ideas and experiences. And see the political situation in the country very differently, outside of the racialized ethnic appeals of the past, and more attention to the kind of issues that have emerged in the contemporary context.
That really sums up the whole idea of the 1 year of Sheraton Move. So thank you very much, Bridget, for joining me in this episode.
Most pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Norman, for bringing me aboard.
You're listening to Bicara Minggu Ini, uncovering current affairs and politics. And you can listen to the stories and interviews on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you can find podcasts. For more updates and stories, if you have any suggestions, you can tweet to me at I'mNongor. Thank you for listening.